Well, my most vivid memory would have to be just first coming here and feeling like we've come to heaven.
Here I became a bride. Here I became a mother. And here I started to live again.
We are at Fort Ontario State Historic Site in Oswego, New York.
And the community in Oswego opened its arms to them. That, to me, was one of the most thrilling parts of the whole experience.
We have a tendency to want simple history. We want heroes and villains, and we want things to be clear, and history is never clear.
Because Fort Ontario is where the Holocaust came to America. It's where everyday Americans first met the victims of Nazis and their persecution, got their stories, reporters got it. So it's where the Holocaust goes from the back pages of American newspapers to the front pages.
In the 1930s and 1940s, Americans are already aware of Hitler's rise to power and his inhumane actions towards Jews, and they feel sympathetic towards victims of the Holocaust. But despite their knowledge and sympathy, most Americans oppose letting refugees into their country. Facing pressure from U.S. allies to take action, President Roosevelt establishes the War Refugee Board, an agency that is tasked with finding ways to help people fleeing Nazi persecution. The board finds that Italy is overflowing with refugees and that there are way too many for the U.S. troops there to take care of. So, they propose establishing a refugee camp in the continental United States, getting 1,000 refugees out of Italy.
And so it was a good reason to both symbolically open a camp, but it was also practical. It was getting about 1,000 people out of Italy and out of the military having to deal with them and help them.
And so Roosevelt advanced the idea of opening a shelter in the continental United States to convince our allies and the Nazis as well that the United States was open and interested and serious about providing rescue and relief to the Jews of Europe.
It happens really fast. Roosevelt announces it in early June 1944, and the first weekend in August 1944, the refugees arrive in Oswego.
Oswego is a small port city near the fort and situated right on Lake Ontario. It was also the place where ordinary Americans first came into contact with the refugees.
We got off the train from Hoboken, New Jersey, and the first sight was the sight of the fence and the barbed wire. It stunned some of the people who were shocked that they would be living once again in a camp.
My first impression was one of disappointment that after 3 years in the concentration camp, I was behind barbed wire again.
And everything is relative. And when you come out of an environment where survival is a luxury, then this is heaven. And it's interesting that many people remember the fence as being something to worry about.
Ominous, and it wasn't.
And to us, it wasn't, because we'd seen so much worse. This was just the fence. And it was such a relief to be among people who we felt safe with, rather than among people who were out to exterminate us. That it was a wonderful memory to be in Oswego.
And they stood at the gate and the fence, and then slowly they came in and were registered. And the townspeople were very curious and came and stood there and began talking to them through the fence. And when they discovered who they were, and many of them had come without shoes, some had newspapers wrapped around their legs, and some were in rags, they ran home and brought shoes and clothes and dolls for the little girls. And slowly the camp life began.
The townspeople tried to talk to us because they wanted to give us gifts. And I remember coming to the fence sometimes, and someone would point to me and hold up a sweater and throw the sweater over the fence so I'd catch it.
There was a bustling social life at the fort, where they had their own little self-contained community complete with a bakery and their own fire station. Then, when refugees started going to school in Oswego, the two communities got to know each other more.
That was the most wonderful experience of all. I did not expect to go back to school at that point. I had missed school for 6 years in Italy during my stay in Italy, mostly during the war.
We were thrown into the mainstream of American education here at the high school, which must have presented a great challenge to the school. But the school system, the administration of the school, the teachers in the school, as well as the student body, really lived up to this challenge in a most positive way.
I know that when I left Oswego, I spoke and read perfect English by the time I left, just a short few months later.
And socially at Fort Ontario, we really had a wonderful experience. We made a lot of friends. We kept together. We had dances. We had our own club. We had our own affairs, and we were just we were teenagers. For the first time, of course, we were the right age to be teenagers, but we could live our lives the way we should, one would imagine you would live it for that age.
There was a movie on once a week, film place. There were people in the camp who wrote plays and music, and we hung around. People were kind, friendly, curious. Once we started going to school, I made a lot of friends in town. We went to parties, played spin the bottle. It was a good entry into American life.
As the war comes to an end, the refugees are faced with a new problem. What will happen to them after the war is over?
The local citizens, many of them became advocates of the refugees to allow them to stay in the country. Heads of families of these refugees had signed documents saying that they would return to Europe when the war ended. And they're very much in fear of that. And then when Truman does his directive in December 22nd, 1945, the refugees are allowed to stay in the United States if they want to. And that's the beginning, the birthplace of U.S. refugee policy.
And so the refugees began the process of gaining citizenship.
That was one of the real miracles of the shelter. Everyone pitched in. The Boy Scouts got in there, helped everyone take all the photographs for their visa documents. All the students who took business at the high school, they knew how to type. So what should have taken months took 30 days.
And with that, the story of the emergency refugee shelter at Fort Ontario ends. Then, America forgot it ever existed.
I grew up in Rochester, so I didn't hear about it until I was already working at the museum. I had no idea that there were refugees in upstate New York. It's just not covered in school. It might be now, but it really wasn't.
In Oswego, there are still a few people who aren't aware. On the other hand, many more know.
So I think it is starting to get more widely known.
And as more people become familiar with the history of the shelter, they can better empathize with the refugees in the same way that the townspeople of Oswego did decades ago. The fort story is also evidence that a lot of the generalizations that we make about U.S. involvement in World War II aren't entirely correct.
And the United States is never one thing. I think we have a tendency to say, well, the United States was indifferent. The United States did nothing. And look around America. We don't agree on anything, Americans. We battle all the time. And people were battling throughout the 1930s and throughout the 1940s to have the US government do something. And by 1944, they won. And I think that is a really important thing for us to learn, that public sentiment can change US policy, that pressure works. It takes a long time sometimes, but it can work. It should have happened much earlier. It should have happened in the 1930s. But it did happen in 1944. And if we forget that it happened, then we lose the ability to learn from it. We lose the ability to try to make it happen earlier next time.
I think the significance shows what immigrants could contribute to America. Here were only 1,000 people who took whatever America gave them with relish, with enthusiasm and excitement, and then in turn gave it back by making all these contributions to medicine, to science, to teaching. I could go right down the line.
People have to get to know refugees. So Oswego was your typical American community. Once they got to know people, they became their friends and advocates.
I think whenever we have the opportunity to meet people and learn their stories, it becomes harder and harder to deal with them as numbers. And that to me is one of the stories of Fort Ontario, is that the town and the US to some extent got to know these people, and then it became hard to think about sending them back.
There was a band of little girls that hung around together, all from Yugoslavia, and we became Girl Scouts together. And we couldn't afford a whole uniform, so the townspeople let us just wear the little scarves without the whole uniform. And there we were looking for ingredients to bake Girl Scout cookies. In those days, they baked the Girl Scout cookies themselves. We had to, instead of paying millions and millions of dollars to some executives to pass around the boxes now, which is what's going on. And we baked these cookies, and I don't remember where we baked them, but they tasted like poison. They were terrible. And to this day, I'm a terrible baker. I've never been able to get over that. It's only because I didn't have a whole uniform. I only had a little scarf, and I couldn't bake without the official Girl Scout uniform. I would have been a fabulous baker to this day.